Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week, 2 Elven Kingdoms down, 1 Elven Kingdom left. Nargothrond and Doriath are done. And given the title of this week's chapter, I don't have good feelings about Gondolin's chances of surviving the first age of Middle-earth. We talked last week about the shift in tone and distance and style between the stories of Túrin Turambar and the ruin of Doriath. And as I foreshadowed back then, that is only going to continue. That is only going to become more extreme as we move into the story of Tuor and the fall of Gondolin. In fact, I think that we are further from the ground in this chapter than we have been since men came into Beleriand, or since the sun and the moon were created. We're really elevating our rhetorical level here so that we can encompass, well, the entire history of the fall of Gondolin in a very, very brief chapter, which works out because this week, in addition to recording this at 2 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon with a cup of coffee unexpectedly perched at my elbow, I have a real hard out this week. And I know sometimes I say I have a hard out and then I flout convention and crash through that closing time anyway. But this week it really is. I have to get out of here in 90 minutes, come hell or high water. So if the end of today's show is a little curtailed, then I apologize in advance. But it does give us more time as we're wrestling with this fairly short chapter. Well, if not for distraction, then for some tangents, and if not for tangents, then for some added context. And a question right at the top of the show. Yes, Glorfin David says, hi, Alistair, just saying hi briefly as events here in the Fourth Age call me away, as they are wont to do. The problem with the Fourth Age, Glorfin David, and to all of you at home, as I'm sure you know, is that there's just no real sense of unfolding history, right? We're just living in a time that seems to be bereft of any real calamity. It's been a tough week, you guys. I don't know how you're doing, but let's distract ourselves for a while with this history of the First Age. I'm sorry that you can't join us live more fully, Glorfin David, because, of course, we are going to be talking a little about your namesake this week and his great moment of triumph there in the mountains above Gondolin. So before we get to all of that, I wanted to pick up, if I can find it here, yes, a question, a comment on last week's YouTube video from Solo Traveler, hello Solo Traveler, who wrote, I was thinking about what you said regarding the halls of Mandos and Purgatory. It sounds as though you don't think the halls serve this purpose, but would you concede that they are at least somewhat similar? It's not explicitly stated, but if the halls, aren't Purgatory, then why do only some elves get new bodies while others stay in Mandos forever? It seems to me that Feanor and the other Kinslayers have to stay because they had too much to atone for at the opposite extreme. Luthien was given a chance to skip the halls altogether and go to Valinor. This is such a great question, and I'll admit that after last week's show, buoyed as I was by I don't know, 2.25 hours of podcasting and a little birthday whiskey, I stayed up pretty late thinking about exactly this, thinking about the rules as we understand them, as they are presented to us. And it's a very complicated picture. I kind of fundamentally, first off, stand by my position that the halls of Mandos are not purgatory, right? They're not purgatory in the Catholic sense, in the Christian sense. They are not there to purge one of sin, to get one to a sufficient level of holiness so that one might enter heaven. That is why purgatory exists. That is what purgatory does in the Catholic conception of the afterlife. And there's no sense, I think, in which souls are being purged in the halls of Mandos. They're not halls of rectification. They are halls of simply waiting. But you're right, there is something complicated happening right under the surface. So if we kind of take the anticipatory rejoinder to those who want to think about Tolkien's created theology as being identical to his real world theology, which I think is lazy and kind of indefensible as we look at the text of this book, right? This is not a Catholic world that we're entering into here. So if we strip that argument out and we look instead, then I think there's something to it. The halls don't fulfill the same purpose, but there are instances in which there's inarguably judgment associated with those who come in and those who come out, right? I've got some slides here just to give a little visual distinction, I suppose, as we move forward here. This is from Chapter 3 of the Quinta, when Melkor is captured and imprisoned, right? Quote, there he lay upon his face before the feet of Manwë and sued for pardon, but his prayer was denied, and he was cast into prison, into the fastness of Mandos, whence none can escape, neither Vala, nor elf, nor mortal man. And that's of the coming of elves and the captivity of Melkor. He is imprisoned, as we'll remember, for three ages of the Valar, the 300 years of the years of the trees, right? So a long time at that point. But here we can see the judgment. Unlike Angband, we can also see that people don't just wander out of the halls of Mandos. We can infer that Mandos has to rubber stamp every exit from his halls, which invites us to speculate about the inclusion of men on this list, right? Neither Vala, under what circumstances are the Valar going to find themselves in the halls of Mandos is an open question at this point. Neither Vala, nor elf, nor mortal man. Are mortal men going to be consistently released from the halls of Mandos? One aside, of course. Well, perhaps. It's fascinating. Yeah. Let's take a look at specific examples then, because we have very few of them, right? We have the Silmarillion. Okay, let me pause here. Strictly within the pages of the Silmarillion, without recourse to the Lord of the Rings or to other supporting texts, we get only specific information on Finrod Felagund, who we're told is with his father Finarfin and Tirion upon Tuna after his death and burial on Tol Sirion, and of course Beren and Luthien. Glorfindel, as I foreshadowed previously, is going to return in The Lord of the Rings to take Frodo to safety in Rivendell, to hang around for like 2 full chapters, and then to disappear completely from the rest of the book until after the War of the Ring is over, when he gets one reference right at the end of the Return of the King, right at the middle of the Return of the King, when he shows up to Minas Tirith for the big party after the coronation. That's the fate of Glorfindel, of course. By contrast, let's take a look at Feanor. Let me call the slide up again here. This is from Chapter 13 of The Return of the Noldor. This is the death of Feanor, son of Finwë. Then his sons raised up their father and bore him back toward Mithrin. But as they drew near to Ithel Sirion and were upon the upward path to the pass over the mountains, Feanor bade them halt, for his wounds were mortal, and he knew that his hour was come. And looking out from the slopes of Eredwethrin, with his last sight, he beheld far off the peaks of Thangorodrim, mightiest of the towers of Middle-earth, and knew with the foreknowledge of death that no power of the Noldor would ever overthrow them. But he cursed the name of Morgoth thrice, and laid it upon his sons to hold to their oath, and to avenge their father. Then he died. But he had neither burial nor tomb, for so fiery was his spirit that as it sped his body fell to ash, and was borne away like smoke, and his likeness never again appeared in Arda, neither has his spirit left the halls of Mandos. Thus ended the mightiest of the Noldor, of whose deeds come both their greatest renown and their most grievous woe. So, the death of Feanor from Chapter 13. Obviously that's a fairly long slide. I have pulled a little more text for reasons which will become apparent later. I wanted to circle back to this in discussion later in today's show. But what's important here, of course, is that he goes to the halls of Mandos and does not return. And we infer from that, I think, that he is being held there. Neither has his spirit left the halls of Mandos. His likeness has never again appeared in Arda. Neither has his spirit left the halls of Mandos, which I think gives us, both sides of the argument there. There has never been anyone like Feanor, right? His likeness has not appeared in Arda, and also he himself has remained with Mandos in his halls. So I promised myself that I gave myself a little rope to do this discussion, and I don't want to go too far down this road. But we do get clarification on this to a certain extent in the Shibboleth of Feanor, which is 35 pages buried in the history of the peoples of Middle-earth, the last volume of the History of Middle-earth series. This was written by Tolkien around 1968, so 15 years out from the publication of The Lord of the Rings, and it's primarily an explanation. Because Professor Tolkien was Professor Tolkien. It's primarily an explanation for how the Thorn character, the letter representing the TH sound, the th sound, in Noldorin is replaced by the Sindarin S, right? See the name of Feanor's mother, which he pronounces Thirinde, not Serinde, right? Midiel Serinde, as I have been saying throughout. Feanor pronounces it Midiel Thirinde, which does kind of give you the impression that all of the sons of Feanor spoke with a compelling lisp. Anyway, as a part of that passage, as a part of the Shibboleth of Feanor, we get this account of his mother, the aforementioned Midiel Serinde. Miriel's death was of free will. She forsook her body, and her Fea went to the halls of waiting, while her body lay as if asleep in a garden. She said that she said that she was weary in body and spirit and desired peace. The cause of her weariness she believed to be the bearing of Feanor, great in mind and body beyond the measure of the Eldar. Her weariness she had endured until he was full grown, but she could endure it no longer. The Valar and all of the Eldar were grieved by the sorrow of Finwë, but not dismayed. All things could be healed in Aman, and when they were rested, her Fea and its body could be reunited and returned to the joy of life in the Blessed Realm. But Midiel was reluctant, and to all the pleas of her husband and her kin that were reported to her, and to the solemn counsels of the Valar, she would say no more than, "Not yet." Each time that she was approached, she became more fixed in her determination, until at last she would listen no more, saying only, "I desire peace. Leave me in peace here. I will not return. That is my will." So the Valar were faced by the one thing that they could neither change nor heal, the free will of one of the children of Eru, which it was unlawful for them to coerce, and in such a case useless, since force could not achieve its purpose. And after some years they were faced by another grave perplexity, when it became clear at last that Miriel would never of her own will return to life in the body within any span of time that could give him hope. Finwë's sorrow became embittered. He forsook his long vigils by her sleeping body and sought to take up his own life again. But he wandered far and wide in loneliness and found no joy in anything that he did. We know, of course, that Finwë will not be alone for long, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So here we, I just have a little bit of trouble here picturing Mandos and Manwë, right, standing around outside the halls. Mandos just kind of looking at each other helplessly, like useless frat boys at a party when this drunk girl has locked herself in the bathroom and is loudly refusing to come out, right? There's just nothing that they can do here because Miriel's free will, firstly, that is important here, and her refusal to return specifically have locked her out of what is clearly supposed to be the normal order of things, right? So when she abandons her body, when she, as we're told in the Silmarillion, lays down in the gardens of Lorien, her Fëa departs from her Hroa, she goes off to the halls of Mandos, and Finwë is saddened by this. He's grieved by this, right? But everyone else is kind of chill. Everyone else is kind of, that's sorry to hear that, buddy, but just give it a couple days, everything's going to be fine. The Valar and all the Eldar were grieved by the sorrow of Finwë, but not dismayed. All things could be healed in Aman, and when they were rested, her Fëa and its body could be reunited and return to the joy of life in the blessed. There's no conception here of a grief that will claim you permanently, right? A grief that will claim you, period, was kind of where I was leaning with that, I suppose. An exhaustion that will claim you. And we can do some psychological reading here of Miriel Serinde and try to understand how she is feeling following the birth of Feanor, or what quasi-metaphysical thing has happened to her spirit, in what way exactly she has been consumed or depleted by the birth of Feanor. We can speculate about the exact mechanism there, but we're left in any case with this same conclusion, which is that she goes into the halls of Mandos and chooses to stay there, and nothing can be done about it, which tells us that free will is an important part of what is happening inside of the halls of Mandos. That it's not that Mandos is a jailer, and certainly it's not that he is some, all-powerful orderly guarding the doors to the ward where everyone hangs out, as though this were, the largest hospital in all of creation. There's something else happening here. So we have the importance of the will of the individual elf, at least in terms of leaving. I should skip ahead here a little. Immediately after this, we are also told that Manwë alone can prevent a soul from returning to their bodily form. And to learn this, we have to go through a bit of a weird story, because the relationship between Finwë and his second wife, I said that he wasn't going to be lonely and finding no joy in anything he did for long. Indeed, he meets with Indis, of course. And this begins a debate, capital D, in which we resolve that Miriel is actually dead. Not just her body, but her spirit, which either cannot be healed, right, in defiance of what we understand to be true about the blessed realm of Aman. Either Miriel cannot be healed, in which case she is functionally dead and has to stay in the halls forever, or she is refusing healing, which just means that there's something broken in her in a different way, right? Not the most incisive depiction here of mental health, for sure. Let's see, what did I pull here? Yes, so we establish that Miriel is not coming back, and we get here the words of Manwë. So she must remain until the end of the world. For from the moment that Finwë and Indis are joined in marriage, all future change and choice will be taken from her, and she will never again be permitted to take bodily shape. Her present body will swiftly wither and pass away, and the Valar will not restore it. For none of the Eldar may have two wives both alive in the world. These were the words of Manwë, and an answer to the doubts that some had felt. For it was known to all the Valar that they alone had the power to heal or restore the body for the rehousing of a Fëa that should, in the later chances of the world, be deprived, but that to Manwë also was given the right to refuse the return of the Fëa. During the time of his sorrow, Finwë had little comfort from Feanor, For a while he also kept vigil by his mother's body, but soon he became wholly absorbed again in his own works and devices. When the matter of Finwë and Indis arose, he was disturbed and filled with anger and resentment, though it is not recorded that he attended the debate or paid heed to the reasons given for the judgment or to its terms except in one point, that Miriel was condemned to remain forever discarnate, so that he could never again visit her or speak with her unless he himself should die. This grieved him, and he grudged the happiness of Finwë and Indis and was unfriendly to their children even before they were born. I find this story outrageous, absolutely fascinating, of course, but also just wild. We justify here, I think, why Fëanor feels the way that he does about Indis, because in their marriage, Finwë and Indis are absolutely dooming Miriel to never return. Let's take a look at what we know then. So the Valar can heal or restore the body, the Hroa, such that the Fëa can return, but Manwë can also prevent this from happening. He can prevent the Fëa from returning, and because we don't allow for discarnate spirits bobbing around the place, that means specifically that he is in refusing to allow the Fëa to return to the Hroa, he is binding that Fëa practically to the halls of Mandos. And I'm reluctant to pull in all of this extra textuality, of course, because we really should be focusing on the Silmarillion, but none of this is contrary to what we see in the Silmarillion, so I'm willing to make the exception here. So, does all of this clarify things? Well, no. Or maybe just a little, right? I maintain that the halls of Mandos don't operate like purgatory, but there is also, as Solo Traveler points out, obviously something complicated happening in terms of who is allowed out. Miriel Serinde is explicitly prevented from returning because the elves don't want to set a precedent for some hippy-dippy counterculture polycule action here in Aman, and Fëanor, for reasons which aren't exactly clear, is also prevented from returning. I say the reasons aren't exactly clear, but they do make emotional sense. It does make sense to us intuitively, I think, that Fëanor does not return, though of course we are saying that from our perspective as men of the Fourth Age rather than elves of the First. I think chiefly the reason that we are confounded by this is because our sample size is simply so small. In almost every instance, our sample size is one single individual. I don't think that there's a version of the Halls of Mandos that's explicitly given to us in the pages of the Silmarillion that applies to more than one person, right? So we get Luthien, one elf who returns to Middle-earth but then isn't an elf again. If we zoom out a little bit to encompass the Lord of the Rings, then we get Glorfindel, who is an elf who goes in and comes out as an elf again, recognizably in his own body. Finrod comes back, but stays in Valinor, and even at this point in the history, when Valinor is physically real and is physically located on the same flat planet as Middle-earth, Valinor still feels different. It feels as though the rules there are different than... It feels as though returning to Valinor is not the same thing as returning to Middle-earth, for sure. Miriel doesn't come back because she doesn't want to. Fëanor doesn't come back regardless of what he wants. But we don't know about Fingolfin or Eol or Thingol or Beleg or Caranthir or Finwë. In fact, you'll remember that Finwë dies not long after the events of Miriel's death because he is murdered by Morgoth at Formenos. So we don't know. We don't really have enough information to extract from this a comprehensive approach. Suffice it to say that I don't think that the Halls of Mandos fulfill a simple theological function in the way that purgatory does, right? Purgatory assumes that all human souls to some greater or lesser extent are stained with sin, and that sin must be cleansed so that you can enter heaven. That doesn't seem to be the case. There doesn't seem to be a clear concept or provision for, as I mentioned back when we introduced men into Arda, Tolkien left space for a conceptual original sin, but never dives into exactly what that is, exactly what he means by that. And we revisit some notions of original sin in the Catholic sense in the Akalabaeth, which we'll hopefully get to in a couple of weeks' time, and the story of Numenor. There are parallels there, right? There is typology there, as we've discussed before. So that sense of purging doesn't quite work, but by extension, a simple philosophical mechanism doesn't seem to hold true for the Halls of Mandos either. It is impossible to be certain of the rules without a much, much larger data set. We don't really know what the men are doing there, what the souls of men are doing. Are they bound there for a time before they pass from the Halls of Mandos to whatever is next, or are they bound to the end of the world? Is the functional difference there specifically that they don't return again? And at the end of the world, at the end of history, the doors are going to be flung open and elves will return back into Arda and the men won't? We can't really be sure. But yeah, I think it's fascinating, endlessly, boundlessly fascinating, of course, which is why we're taking just a little bit of time to talk about it at the beginning of this week's show. And by a little bit of time, I mean 20 minutes. We must move on, but thank you, Solo Traveler, so much for the question. I hope that the extra context has given you more to think about. It's certainly given me more to think about, too. Let's get into, then, Tuor and the fall of Gondolin. I want to pause for a second here right at the beginning to talk a little about the textual history and then really to explain a little, well, I'm not sure explain is the right verb there, to comment a little on how brief this chapter is. And to do that, we have to dive a little into the textual history. Tuor and the Exiles of Gondolin, which bringeth in the great tale of Eärendil, that's the original title, is written between 1916 and 1917 when Tolkien is recovering in hospital following the Battle of the Somme. This is the period during which all three of the great tales are written. Turambar and the Foaloke, the first version of Túrin's story, and the Tale of Tinuviel, the first version of the Beren and Luthien story too. Tuor and the Exiles of Gondolin is revised around 1920 because Tolkien is going to give a reading at Exeter College in Oxford. Then it's revised again a little, well, there's a printed version, right? That version is printed in the Book of Lost Tales, Volume 2. That's like 80 pages long. It's about the same length as the others. By contrast, the version in the Silmarillion, in my reading copy, which you can see half here behind me, is 7 pages long. It's a seriously condensed version. Tolkien begins a poetic version in the early 1920s, but he abandons it after 150 lines, which compared to the Lay of Lathian's 4,200 lines is barely anything at all. And what's wild is that in the 150 lines that he writes of the poetic version of the story of Tuor and the fall of Gondolin, he really manages to get like quite a distance into the story. It's obviously not going to be a long piece if it's ever finished, and of course it wasn't ever finished because so many of the professor's pieces were never finished. We then get a very, very brief outline of the story in the Sketch of the Mythology, which I mentioned before, in 1926. And then he circles back to this story in 51, which is partly used by Christopher along with Tuor A, the first version that we get in 1916, 1917, to compile this version that we get in the Silmarillion. The point is that though it is one of the three great stories, it receives much less attention from Professor Tolkien in his life during his writing career than the other two stories do. He keeps coming back to Beren and Luthien. He keeps coming back to Turin Turambar and the Children of Húrin. He doesn't really keep coming back to Tuor and the Fall of Gondolin, and it's not clear from really any of the material why that is the case. It just seems that this story does less to ignite his imagination than the others do. There's less here. So I wanted to talk about these original versions, right? As they are printed in the Lost Tales, Túrin gets like 28 pages, Beren and Luthien gets like 25 pages, and the story of Tuor also gets like 25 pages. They're all roughly the same length, which means that no, I'm sorry, I'm reading the wrong thing there. There are 80 pages in the Lost Tales. I'm talking about the version that's presented in the Silmarillion. Forgive me, my notes here are scattered because I prepared this. As you can see from the fact that I didn't put my book back up properly on the shelf beside me here, I was preparing this right before I went live with today's broadcast. In the original, they are all roughly the same length. In the Book of Lost Tales, in the original drafted versions, they are all roughly the same length. However, in this bound volume, in this reading copy of the Silmarillion that I have, they are very different. As I say, the chapter dedicated to Turin Turambar is 28 pages, plus a few more at the beginning of the next chapter to cover the end of Húrin's life. Of course, we're not completely encapsulating that whole Children of Húrin story inside one chapter. Beren and Luthien is 25 pages, which does actually cover almost all of their story, beside their cameo near the end of the life of Doriath. But the story of Tuor and the Fall of Gondolin is 7 pages. So we're clearly getting a very distant version of history here. We're getting a very distant account. This is unlike the story of Túrin and unlike the story of Beren, in that we are much less close to the ground, much less engaged with our primary characters. It is much less an heroic narrative, right, than it is a very or relatively cold and clinical account of history. And partly I think that is because what the story of Tuor is missing in terms of elven engagement, right? We're being reminded again, I think, that the Silmarillion is a collection of texts prepared by elven historians, elven writers for sure. I think that Tuor is distinct in that the role of the man, the thing that is unknown in this story, is just much harder to pin down. It's much more elusive in that way. I would recommend the version in the Book of Lost Tales Volume 2. I think that, honestly, reading all three of those stories is great. I think that partly because of the brevity of the story of Tuor as it's presented to us in the Silmarillion, the version that we get in the Book of Lost Tales is so rich, it's so powerful, so much of it is dedicated to battle, right? I think that it is the longest description of battle that we get in all of Tolkien's works. It's a really detailed analysis of how Morgoth takes Gondolin and the heroism on the streets. It's compelling stuff, so I would recommend it. But yeah, not what we are getting here in the pages of the Silmarillion. So, if all of that context suggests to you that the story of Tuor is somehow inessential, then I'm afraid that I have misled you, because I really do think that the story of Tuor is of vital importance. We're going to talk a little about Tuor as contrasted with Túrin. We're going to talk a little about the fall of Gondolin as contrasted with the fall of Doriath and the fall of Nargothrond. And we're going to kind of see this story prismatically as a reflection of all the other stories of Beleriand, because there is a way in which you can read the fall of Gondolin, particularly through the character of Turgon, as an encapsulation of everything else that has happened in the Quintus Silmarillion, in effect, besides the actual creation of the Silmarils, I guess. But we'll get to all of that. So let's see. I should mention too, I suppose, how much we're paying off here as well, right? How much kind of comes into focus, because we really are closing the door on a lot of open narrative threads that have persisted since, the halfway point of the Quintus Silmarillion. We're kind of closing up on the prophecies of Ulmo that led to the creation of Nargothrond and Gondolin in the first place. We're circling all the way back to the story of Maeglin, and we're adding some terminal punctuation, some much needed terminal punctuation to that story. We're going to be returning to Idril Celebrimbor. We'll be looking at what happens to her, Glorfindel and Ixalion, as I've mentioned before, and we're going to be talking about, well, the absence, mostly, right? We're going to be talking about Turgon in absentia. When he shows up at the beginning of this week's reading, it's to make some bad choices, and then he kind of vanishes, which is interesting in and of itself. So, let's set the stage. Previously, 400 years ago, Turgon completed Gondolin and moved his people there from Vinyamar in Nevrust, out there on the western coast of Hithlum. 100 years ago, Maeglin and his mother Arathal returned to Gondolin from the woodland realm of Eol the Dark Elf, who followed after, confronted Turgon, killed his wife Arathal, and then, with his final breath, cursed his son Maeglin to die as he dies, being hurled from the walls of Gondolin. We'll keep track of that as we move through this week, too. Much later, Túrin was released by Morgoth. He took up the Nauglamir out of the ruin of Nargothrond. He brings it to King Thingol of Doriath. He sparks a war within Doriath, another kinslaying. The Doriath falls, Menegroth falls. Túrin is dead, Mablung is dead, Thingol is dead, Beren and Luthien are dead. Melian has returned to the Blessed Realm. Celegorm, Caranthir, and Curufin are dead. Dior and Nimloth and their sons Elored and Elorin are dead, but their daughter Elwing has fled to the Bay of Balar and the elves of Círdan, the shipwright. That is kind of where we are in our temporal passage through the Silmarillion, though, of course, as is traditional by this point, we are now going to reset and get a little flashback as we begin this new chapter. We're going to do this, of course, with the introduction of Tuor. It has been told that Tuor, the brother of Túrin, was slain in the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, and in the winter of that year, Rian, his wife, bore a child in the wilds of Mithrim, and he was named Tuor, and was taken to foster by Anail of the Grey Elves, who yet lived in those hills. Now, when Tuor was 16 years old, the elves were minded to leave the caves of Androth where they dwelt, and to make their way secretly to the havens of Sirion in the distant south. But they were assailed by orcs and Easterlings before they made good their escape, and Tuor was taken captive and enslaved by Lorgon, chief of the Easterlings of Hithlum. For 3 years he endured that thraldom, but by the end of that time he escaped, and returning to the caves of Androth, he dwelt there alone, and did such great hurt to the Easterlings that Lorgon set a price upon his head. But when Tuor had lived thus in solitude as an outlaw for 4 years, Ulmo set it in his heart to depart from the lands of his fathers, for he had chosen Tuor as the instrument of his designs. And leaving once more the caves of Androth, he went westwards across Dorloman and found Anon and Gareth, the gate of the Noldor, where the people of Turgon built, which they dwelt in Nevrast long before. Thence a dark tunnel led beneath the mountains and issued into Cirith Niniach, the rainbow cleft, through which a turbulent water ran toward the western sea. Thus it was that Tuor's flight from Hithlum was marked by neither man nor orc, and no knowledge of it came to the ears of Morgoth. The progression of phenomenological time can be a blessing as well as a curse. Sure, we get older and we grow perhaps more jaded, and the world can seem to grow darker. We suffer the harms and hurts, not all of which heal as they ought, and the world begins to run away from us. And sometimes we may even realize that there is more past behind than future ahead. But sometimes the passage of time is awesome. And I mention this because a year ago, had we sat down here together in June of 2024, I would have been absolutely compelled when discussing the son of Húrin's brother Huor and the fall of Gondolin to make a Hawk Tuor joke. And I have been freed from that curse. I don't have to do it because a year has passed and no one remembers Hawk Tuor, and that's great. So we don't have to do that. But I had a moment of temporal vertigo when sitting down to start my notes and realizing, I don't have to do this. I could just not do it. So I'm drawing your attention to the joke that I'm not making, which is in its own way a kind of making that joke. But I'm sure you're glad that I'm not making it with more sincerity. Here we rewind to the year 503 YS, and rewind from, the year 503 of the Years of the Sun, the events of the Second Kinslaying, the fall of Doriath, to 488, 15 years earlier, or at least that is where we begin the slide. Huor, the brother of Húrin, was slain in the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. In the winter of that year, Rian, his wife, bore a child in the wilds of Mithrim. He was named Tuor and was taken to foster because, as you may recall, Rian takes herself to the Hill of the Slain in the Anfauglith and casts herself down there to die. So Tuor is taken to foster by an elf, another way in which we can parallel Tuor and Túrin. This is the point, I guess, if we're going to parallel those two, we should look at the timeline a little bit, because this is the point at which Túrin is living at Amon Ruth with Beleg Strongbow and their band of merry outlaws, right? The point at which Tuor is enslaved by the Easterlings is the same time when Túrin is playing outlaw. By the time Tuor goes to Nevrast here at the end of this piece, it is 495 in the Year of the Sun, and Nargothrond is about to fall, as we will see in just a little while. So as I say, it's tempting just from this brief biographical introduction to parallel Tuor and Túrin. They are cousins. They are sons of brothers, as cousins so often are. Their names bear the same relationship to their father's names. That is the replacement of an H with AT. Húrin and Túrin, Huor and Tuor. There are, though, differences. You know, they've been fostered by elves in the absence of their fathers. They spend time as outlaws, but there are differences. And most notably, of course, I think we should be thinking of the curse of Morgoth upon Húrin, right? That Túrin is laboring under that direct curse. Tuor, by contrast, is unknown to Morgoth, but has a different kind of burden on his shoulders. Not the burden of a curse, but the burden of prophecy. He has not been marked by Morgoth, he has been chosen by Ulmo. And I think that we can see these two things in stark contrast. You'll remember that when Huor died, he tells Turgon, as Turgon will remember in a couple of slides' time, when Huor dies, he tells Turgon not to give up hope on Gondolin. This is the quote: "Yet if it stands but a little while, then out of your house shall come the hope of elves and man. This I say to you, Lord, with the eyes of death. Though we part here forever, and I shall not look on your white walls again, from you and from me a new star shall arise. Farewell." That's the last words of Huor to Turgon, as Turgon is leading the Gondolindrim away from the Battle of Unnumbered Tears and back to Gondolin proper. So we see, again, that parallel with Túrin, but this very different consequence. Tuor lives on his own. Oh, and as I'm comparing, of course, Tuor and Túrin, we should be folding some thoughts of Beren into this too, right? Life as an outlaw under the oppression of the Easterlings, kind of this ongoing, notable kind of opposition to Morgoth. Time alone in the aftermath of the destruction that has been brought to their people by Morgoth, right? Tuor kind of spending time alone here in the caves of Androth isn't unlike isn't unlike Beren spending time alone after his father is killed. But when Tuor had lived in solitude as an outlaw for 4 years, Ulmo set it in his heart to depart from the lands of his father. So this is the moment, the touch of prophecy here, the touch of fate here. For he had chosen Tuor as the instrument of his designs. And Tuor does. He does as he is told. He immediately obeys. He leaves the caves. He goes westward across Dor Lomin. He finds the gate of the Noldor, which the people of Turgon built when they dwelt in Nevrast long years before. Then he takes the tunnel through the mountains and issues into the Cirith Niniach, one of the best pieces of Sindarin language that we get, right? The rainbow cleft. It's glossed right there for us. But there are a few things in the pages of the Silmarillion that are more fun to say than the Cirith Niniach, for sure. Through which a turbulent water ran toward the western sea. Thus it was that Tuor's flight from Hithlum was marked by neither man nor orc, but no knowledge of it came to the ears of Morgoth. So that is perhaps the most important distinction between Tuor and Túrin at this point, is that Morgoth is painfully aware of the one and absolutely ignorant of the other. Let's get then to Ulmo. And Tuor came into Nevrast, and looking upon Beligar, the great sea, he was enamored of it, and the sound of it and the longing for it were ever in his heart and ear, and an unquiet was on him that took him at last into the depths of the realms of Ulmo. Then he dwelt in Nevrast alone, and the summer of that year passed, and the doom of Nargothrond drew near. But when the autumn came, he saw 7 great swans flying south, and he knew them for a sign that he had tarried overlong, and he followed their flight along the shores of the sea. Thus he came at length to the deserted halls of Vinyamar beneath Mount Taras, and he entered in, and found there the shield and hauberk and the sword and helm that Turgon had left there by the command of Ulmo long before. And he arrayed himself in those arms, and went down to the shore. But there came a great storm out of the west, and out of that storm Ulmo, the Lord of Waters, arose in majesty, and spoke to Tuor as he stood beside the sea. And Ulmo bade him depart from that place and seek out the hidden kingdom of Gondolin, and he gave Tuor a great cloak to mantle him in shadow from the eyes of his enemies. But in the morning when the storm was past, Tuor came upon an elf standing beside the walls of Vinyamar, and he was Voronwe, son of Aranwe of Gondolin, who sailed in the last ship that Turgon sent into the west. But when the ship returning at last out of the deep ocean foundered in the great storm within sight of the coasts of Middle-earth, Ulmo took him up, alone of all its mariners, and cast him onto the land near Vinyamar. And learning of the command laid upon Tuor by the Lord of Waters, Voronwe was filled with wonder, and did not refuse him his guidance to the hidden door of Gondolin. Therefore they set out together from that place, and as the fell winter of that year came down upon them out of the north, they went warily eastward under the eaves of the mountains of shadow. I am so tempted to sidebar here into an extended thought experiment of what would have happened to Túrin had he received this kind of message from Ulmo. But on the one hand, that would be a very long discussion, and on the other, it has a fairly simple conclusion, I think, which is that he would not have behaved as Tuor does. I think that when we're looking at differences in character, we see all of this hot-headedness, all of this Feanorian character from Túrin, but we see a real patience and peace here from Tuor. And I don't think that it's a coincidence then that Tuor is bound to the ocean in a way that Túrin isn't, right? We have this injunction from Ulmo to come to Nevrast in the first place, but when he first sees the sea, he is enamored of it, and the sound of it and the longing for it were ever in his heart and ear, and an unquiet was on him that took him at last into the depths of the realms of Ulmo. That is the end of Tuor's life, right? That is what we are going to read about at the very end of this admittedly very brief chapter. But there is the sea longing within the heart of Tuor that we have seen previously in the heart of some of the elves, that the power of the sea has kindled within him. I don't like using the word kindled there, right? Because it's kind of antithetical to the notion of the water, I suppose. The power of the sea has moistened somewhat within him, and he has been moved by it and will be moved by it for the rest of his life. But he has here a mission, and he sees what I take and what I think we are intended to take as a pretty clear sign from Ulmo. 7 great swans flying south, right? The swan, as we talked about before, the swan boats of Alqualande, of course, the swan being kind of this unification of Ulmo and Manwë, this combination of their skills, the combination of their domains here. So we're getting, yes, the presence of Ulmo, but I think that we're also getting this kind of, this entire endeavor is being co-signed by Manwë here. So he goes to recover, as you might recall. We should maybe gloss some of our names here too, because it's been a moment. Nevrest is the southwestern region of Hithlum, which is west of Dor-lómin. It's the region that is initially settled by Turgon when he comes to Middle-earth. He builds the city of Vinyamar, which means new home, just laying it right out there. He builds it in the shadow of Mount Taras, and he lives there for a short time until he relocates all of his people to Gondolin, as I say, 450 years ago. And now would be a good time to remember, because we're not going to get the opportunity to really talk about it later in the reading, that Turgon is among the most Valar-oriented of all of the Noldor. He's anti the Sons of Feanor before they leave Valinor, a condition that is only exacerbated by the death of his wife Elenwe during the crossing of the Helcaraxa, right? So he's already standing against the Sons of Feanor, but caught up still in the doom of the Noldor. Then he loses his wife in the grinding ice of the Helcaraxa. When he makes it to Middle-earth, he goes to the western extremity of Beleriand. He goes to the point that is as close as he possibly can get to Valinor and builds a place that is somewhat reminiscent of Valinor. And then when Ulmo tells him to build Gondolin, to go and build his hidden city, he builds it as an explicit echo of Tirion upon Tuna. He is rebuilding the home of the Noldor here in Middle-earth. Before Turgon leaves Vinyamar for the last time, as I'm sure you recall, Ulmo comes, this is the quote that Ulmo tells him, "Leave therefore in this house arms and a sword, and that in years to come he may find them, and thus shalt thou know him and not be deceived." This is back in chapter 15 of the Noldor in Beleriand, and here, pages and pages, chapters and chapters later, it pays off. This is what is left here for Tuor to find: the shield and the hauberk, the sword and the helm. Oh, we should also mention, of course, Voronwe, who, we kind of get the minor encapsulation of his story here, but we have heard of him, we have heard of this desperate last mission before. As the passage tells us, he's one of the sailors dispatched by Turgon in the aftermath of the Battle of Unnumbered Tears to go to Valinor and to beg aid and forgiveness. All of those missions fail. He is the only survivor of his personal mission, and is, as we see here, conspicuously borne up by the hand of Ulmo to the coast of Nevras. Voronwe, appropriately enough, translates as steadfast. So now, completely unknown to Morgoth, and now cloaked in this literal cloak of Ulmo to mantle him in shadow from the eyes of his enemies, right? Not unlike Luthien in this moment. Now, Tuor and Voronwe are going to go to Gondolin. At length, they came in their journey into the pools of Ivrin, and looked with grief on the defilement wrought there by the passage of Glaurung, the dragon. But even as they gazed upon it, they saw one going northward in haste, and he was a tall man, clad in black and bearing a black sword. But they knew not who he was, nor anything of what had befallen in the south, and he passed them by, and they said no word. And at the last, by the power that Ulmo set upon them, they came to the hidden door of Gondolin, and passing down the tunnel, they reached the inner gate, and were taken by the guard as prisoners. Then they were led up the mighty ravine of Orfalch Echor, barred by 7 gates, and brought before Ecthelion of the Fountain, the warden of the great gate at the end of the climbing road. And there Tuor cast aside his cloak, and from the arms that he bore from Vinyamar, it was seen that he was, in truth, one sent by Ulmo. Then Tuor looked down upon the fair vale of Tumladen, set as a green jewel amid the encircling hills. And he saw far off upon the rocky height of Amon Gwareth Gondolin the Great, city of 7 names, whose fame and glory is mightiest in song of all dwellings of the elves in the hitherlands. At the bidding of Ecthelion, trumpets were blown in the towers of the great gate, and they echoed in the hills, and far off but clear there came a sound of answering trumpets blown upon the white walls of the city, flushed with the rose of dawn upon the plain. Thus it was that the son of Huor rode across Tumladen, and came to the gate of Gondolin. And passing up the wide stairways of the city, he was brought at last to the tower of the king, and looked upon the images of the trees of Valinor. Then Tuor stood before Turgon, son of Fingolfin, high king of the Noldor, and upon the king's right hand there stood Maeglin, his sister son, but upon his left hand sat Idril Celebrindle, his daughter. And all that heard the voice of Tuor marvelled, doubting that this were in truth a man of mortal race, for his words were the words of the Lord of Waters that came to him in that hour. And he gave warning to Turgon that the curse of Mandos now hastened to its fulfillment, and all the works of the Noldor should perish. And he bade him depart, and abandon the fair and mighty city that he had built, and go down Sirion to the sea. Figure in Black sounds pretty cool. I sure hope we get to spend 3 weeks discussing his story. This is, of course, Túrin fleeing north to Dor-lómin in pursuit of his mother and sister under the fell influence of Glaurung. This is their sole moment of intersection, and it's honestly kind of delightful that we're getting this Avenger-style crossover event in the middle of the book, right? Not only because it is a reminder of a time when those kinds of crossovers were rare and therefore more cool than they are in our, intersectionally saturated media landscape that we find ourselves in now. And we might be tempted to credit this unusually self-aware moment to Christopher in the compilation of the Silmarillion, but it is in fact broadly taken from that original prose version of The Fall of Gondolin. And it isn't just the crossover here that makes this feel like modern high-budget genre TV, but it's because we also get this Lost-style beat that Túrin comes upon the pathway to Gondolin, and it is clear it stands as it always has, while the last time we saw it was in the perspective of Húrin. This is 5 years before Húrin gets to this same point and discovers that the way has been barred. So we're presented with this kind of fragmented timeline. As I say, it feels not unlike Lost. And there's also the interesting speculation here. And I only had this thought this morning, so I haven't really worked it through, because when we think of this moment of intersection between Tuor and Túrin, and we think, or we observe the lack of interaction, right? But they knew not who he was, nor anything of what had befallen in the south, and he passed them by and they said no word. That there's no even recognition here between the two cousins. And I'm wondering if this can be attributed to Túrin's ensorcelment by Glaurung, right? That he is still operating under the spell placed upon him by Glaurung, and to what extent we can credit the cloak given to Tuor by Olma, the protective magics which are concealing Tuor and Voronwe in this moment, which are going to be confirmed for us at the beginning of the very next paragraph. And at last, by the power that Olmo set upon them, they came to the hidden door of Gondolin, right? It's very clear that he is taking an active interest in the passage of Tuor and Voronwe across Beleriand here. So we get our introduction to Gondolin proper in this era. Orfalch Elchor, glosses as the high cleft about the outer circle, which is an open invitation to talk about the layout of Gondolin, which we're going to do in just a moment. I want to talk about Ecthelion, right? Ecthelion glosses as sharp-willed at this point in Tolkien's Legendarium, but Ecthelion as a word has been a recurring feature of many of the languages that he has developed from very early in his career. It originally meant Lord of Fountains, which is this Ecthelion's actual title. So the meaning of his name has changed, but he manages to keep the original meaning of that word as a title, as a sobriquet here. He has been mentioned a couple of times already. In fact, brilliantly, his first mention in the book, back in Chapter 13, contains a major spoiler for this chapter. Quote, "There upon the confines of Dor Daedaloth, the land of Morgoth, Feanor was surrounded with few friends about him. Long he fought on and undismayed, though he was wrapped in fire and wounded with many wounds. But at the last he was smitten to the ground by Gothmog, lord of Balrogs, whom Ecthelion after slew in Gondolin." So, I wonder what Ecthelion's going to do later in this chapter. Ecthelion is also listed in Chapter 20 alongside Glorfindel as one of the great captains of Gondolin, and there is a lot of fan speculation and a kind of fervent fan belief, I suppose, that Ecthelion is the one who wields Glaurung, wields... oh my goodness, the name has completely departed from my mind. It'll come back to me. I will think of it in just a moment. That wields one of the elven swords picked up by Gandalf and Thorin in The Hobbit. Oh no. Here, let's move on. Let's distract me from this collapse of memory here to present for you the cover of the Atlas of Middle-earth, originally published in 1981, revised in 1991, then republished with no further revision in 2001, written by Karen Wynne Fonstad, who is a fascinating figure in the history of Tolkien scholarship because of the work that she did back in the early 1980s. That work is still considered largely definitive. And what she did was read everything that was available to her as carefully as anyone ever has, and then filter it through her post-grad geography studies to create maps of, well, of everything. This is the Atlas of Middle-earth. Fonstad attended the University of Oklahoma, which I mentioned because the University of Oklahoma is in the small town in Oklahoma from which I am recording this podcast right now. And that's like pretty impressive, right? Like that's a weird coincidence that one of the major contributors to Tolkien scholarship over the years attended the university in this town. But 7,500 people graduate from OU every year, so perhaps it's not that surprising. What is much more surprising is that Fonstad was actually born here. She was born in Oklahoma City, 30 miles up the road, but grew up right here in the town of Norman, where I live. She went to the local high school. She was properly local, which I didn't know about until this morning when I researched her biography for the first time, despite the fact that I read the Atlas of Middle-earth in the early 1990s, maybe, and also devoured her Atlas of Kryn, the world of the Dragonlance novels. She also created atlases for the Forgotten Realms, for Pern, and other fictional worlds besides. But Kryn was, gosh, perhaps the most important fantasy world to me for a couple of years there in the late 1980s, early 1990s. If you haven't read the Dragonlance series, then I recommend that you do. Vastly superior to what was coming out of the Forgotten Realms at that period, I will say. I will note that the Atlas is not perfect. There are some internal contradictions. There are some contradictions which are rooted deeply in the text. Tolkien, believe it or not, makes some mistakes when he's talking about the landscapes of Middle-earth. And there are, because it was revised last in 1991, it is revised after, I think, the first 8 volumes of the history of Middle-earth have been published, but the series has not yet been completed. So there's some stuff that comes out after the revised version of the Atlas of Middle-earth, which of course contradicts what is contained in these pages. I mention all of this because I wanted to talk for just a moment and to put in your head, I suppose, a map of Gondolin. And this is quite simply the best map of Gondolin. It is really, I think, a beautiful, beautiful piece of work. Most of this, particularly the inset map of the city of Gondolin itself, is going to be largely irrelevant to us because of the distance with which we're viewing the events of the fall of Gondolin. But nonetheless, there's a real power, I think, that comes from rooting this very strange bit of geography in your kind of visual imaginary, right? Having a sense of what this thing looks like, I think, is only helpful. We can gloss some of these names, though we have glossed most of them before, of course. The Echoriath, there you can see above the valley in the middle of the picture there. The Echoriath are the encircling mountains. That includes the Chrysaegrim, the cleft mountain peaks, the home of the eagles, right there to the south. We've got the Tumladen, right? The Sindarin word for a wide valley, right? Just a wide vale there. Amon Gwareth, which was just mentioned, that is the Hill of Watching. That is the hill, the outcrop right there in the middle of Tumladen, upon which the city of Gondolin has been constructed. And if we look there to the northeast corner of what is presented to us as the inset picture of Gondolin there, you can see Caragdur, the dark spike. That is the place where Eöl was cast to his death. The other one that I want to call out, just because it is so curious and could support an entire episode all on its own, is right there next to the King's Square, just to the southeast of the King's Square, you can see Gar Einion, which is parenthesed as a place of the gods. Gar Einion is unusual in the Legendarium because in that first version of this story, that is the temple, I know, a temple where Tuor and Idril are ceremonially married. There is an actual religious ceremony in a temple in a story that Tolkien wrote of Gondolin. It isn't specifically excised in the version given in the Silmarillion, right? We don't know that Gar Einion is not there. It's not explicitly mentioned that there is no temple found within the streets of Gondolin, but so that's why it still appears on this map. But as it is clear to us that Tolkien pulls back on his inclusion of religious observance, it's interesting to see still the fingerprints of a more present religious practice in the pages of, or both in the history of Beleriand at this point and in the pages of the Silmarillion. I find that so completely fascinating. So you can see here the Orfalch Echor kind of leading from the dry riverbed that gets you access to basically the first gate. That is the hidden way. You can see there marked to Idril's secret way, which we'll get to in just a moment. And yeah, you can see at the bottom of the screen there the vertical profile. I'm not sure how helpful that is, but nonetheless, it does give us, I think, a strong sense of how Gondolin sits here in its context as we are about to see its fall. Let's move on then and get to that fall itself. So, Tuor shows up. Everyone is wowed by him immediately. They are wowed by the armor that he has taken from Vinyamar. They are wowed still further by his voice, which is the voice of Ulmo, right? It is the words of Ulmo issuing forth from Tuor, telling Turgon, give it up. The curse of Mandos upon the Noldor is its time is nigh. Bad things are coming. I know I told you to go make a hidden city, but now you have to leave that hidden city. It's been 400 years, my dude. It did keep you safe through, the Nirnai Tharnodiad, the Dagor Bragalach, right? You have been preserved here, but now that is coming to an end and you have to leave. And so Turgon does what Turgon does. Turgon pondered long the counsel of Ulmo, and there came into his mind the words that were spoken to him in Vinyamar. Love not too well the work of thy hands and the devices of thy heart, and remember that the true hope of the Noldor lieth in the west and cometh from the sea. But Turgon was become proud, and Gondolin as beautiful as a memory of elven Tirion, and he trusted still in its secret and impregnable strength, even though a Vala should gainsay it. And after the Nirnai Tharnodiad, the people of that city desired never again to mingle in the woes of elves and men without, nor to return through dread and danger into the west. Shut behind their pathless and enchanted hills, they suffered none to enter, though he fled from Morgoth, hate pursued. And tidings of the land beyond came to them faint and far, and they heeded them little. The spies of Angband sought for them in vain, and their dwelling was as a rumour and a secret that none could find. Maeglin spoke ever against Tuor in the councils of the king, and his words seemed the more weighty in that they went with Turgon's heart. And at the last he rejected the bidding of Ulmo, and refused his counsel. But in the warning of the Vala, he heard again the words that were spoken before the departing Noldor on the coast of Anaman long ago, and the fear of treason was wakened in Turgon's heart. Therefore, in that time, the very entrance to the hidden door of the encircling mountains was caused to be blocked up, and thereafter none went ever forth from Gondolin on any errand of peace or war while that city stood. Tidings were brought by Thorondor, lord of eagles, of the fall of Nargothrond, and after the slaying of Thingol and of Dior his heir, and of the ruin of Doriath. But Turgon shut his ear to word of the woes without, and vowed to march never at the side of any son of Feanor, and his people he forbade ever to pass the leaguer of the hills. Though even a Vala should gainsay it, carries with it such a fascinating duality, because used colloquially, used in its common sense, gainsay means oppose. If you gainsay something, you are standing opposed to it. Thus, if the strength of Gondolin is being opposed, then we might assume that the Vala who is opposing it would be Morgoth. But what's interesting is that more technically, more formally, gainsay does not mean to oppose, it means to contradict or to deny, in which case, of course, if someone is contradicting the strength, the secret and impregnable strength of Gondolin, then we are talking about Ulmo. And I think that in general, it is far more the latter that is intended here than the former, if indeed the former was intended at all. We all know that Tolkien wasn't particularly open to degraded colloquial uses of language, but if there is any intent to create a kind of dramatic irony there, then I find it all the more rewarding. The movement of language has given us such interesting texture here. So this is the point in history where Gondolin is closed. This is what Hurin discovers after he leaves Angband. The timeline here is a little bit muddy. We are kind of bouncing around a little bit because Tuor arrives in Gondolin in 495, which is the same year that Nargothrond falls. So it's unclear how much time it takes the Gondolindrim to collapse the passage into the city, or if Thorondor brings news of what is happening in Nargothrond while that giant piece of civil engineering is still underway, right? Because, of course, we just saw Túrin, so we know, in fact, that Nargothrond has already fallen. It's unclear how long it takes the news to arrive and how quickly that passageway into the city is now closed. And Doriath, of course, doesn't fall until 506. It doesn't fall for another 11 years. We're almost at the end of Tuor's time in Gondolin, in fact, before Doriath falls properly. It's fortunate. I have had chance, if chance you call it, quoting that earlier passage about Feanor. I quoted that earlier passage about Feanor for entirely different reasons, which we'll get to in a little while. But look here at the echoes, work and devices. This was the quote that I was thinking of when I named this week's session, work and devices. Love not too well the work of thy hands and the devices of thy heart. A common refrain here from Ulma, from the Valar in general, I suppose. But it's lovely to see that echoed so clearly from Feanor now here into the heart of Turgon, another character, right, who is so opposed to Feanor and what Feanor stands for that he becomes a little bit Feanorian because he has fallen to his pride. Gondolin is intended to be evocative of Tirion upon Tuna, but it is so evocative of Tirion upon Tuna that he doesn't want to leave it. He trusts in its secret and impregnable strength, even though Ulmo, who led him to build it in the first place, is telling him that it is not going to fulfill the task for which it was intended much longer. The spies search for them, but they can't find them. And we have Maeglin here, of course, as the vizier character, right? As the worm-tongue character, speaking ever against Tuor in the councils of the king. And his words seem the more weighty in that they went with Turgon's heart. Oh, he's telling the king what he wants to hear. So Turgon is much more readily believing him, and he rejects the bidding of Ulmo and refuses his counsel. But in so doing, he evokes within himself a memory of the curse of the Noldor, right? Which Ulmo has already brought back to his mind, has brought back to his attention. And in his denial of Ulmo, he feels the tug of that curse all the more powerfully. Treachery, right? Treason and fear of treason wakened in Turgon's heart. Therefore, everything gets blocked off. He seals the city completely. And we'll see the consequences of that as we move forward. Excellent, good. I'm getting streaming errors just to really strengthen my position here on a Sunday afternoon. I'm starting to feel that Sunday afternoons are perhaps not the best time for these kinds of broadcasts. Let's move forward here because I only have a half hour left, and we do have a few more slides to get through. Let's get to. Well, I mean, yes, we can be critical of Turgon for sealing up the city. We can be critical of Turgon certainly for ignoring the injunction of Ulmo to leave the city behind. But at least it's Gondolin, and parties happen in Gondolin. Good things happen in Gondolin. And Tuor remained in Gondolin, for its bliss and its beauty and the wisdom of its people held him enthralled, and he became mighty in stature and in mind, and learned deeply of the lore of the exiled elves. Then the heart of Idril was turned to him, and his to her, and Maeglin's secret hatred grew ever greater, for he desired above all things to possess her, the only heir to the king of Gondolin. But so high did Tuor stand in the favour of the king, that when he had dwelt there for 7 years, Turgon did not refuse him even the hand of his daughter. For though he would not heed the bidding of Ulmo, he perceived that the fate of the Noldor was wound with the one whom Ulmo had sent. And he did not forget the words that Tuor spoke to him before the host of Gondolin departed from the battle of unnumbered tears. Then there was made a great and joyful feast, for Tuor had won the hearts of all that people, save only for Maeglin and his secret following. And thus there came to pass the second union of elves and men. A side thought here, I know that there are some beautiful posters, there's some beautiful artwork of Gondolin out there, but is there a retro-styled Visit Gondolin tourist poster, like the sun-bleached colors, like the coral pinks and like the mid-century typography? If there is, I should get one. I'll maybe look after the show and see if I can add something to the show notes. So Idril and Tuor are married, and again, right, we're seeing a similar kind of purified, purged, to go back to our initial conversation about the halls of Mandos, a kind of purged typological echo of what we saw with Túrin and Finduilas, right? We're kind of repositioning our players here. We have Tuor and Idril and Maeglin. I guess Maeglin comes off badly in that. Gwyndor, I suppose, comes off badly in that through the comparison to Maeglin. But we see a kind of better version of what could have been in Nargothrond had Túrin not been laboring under the curse of Morgoth. I think that story could have played out very similarly to this one. The heart of Idril turns to him and his to her, and Maeglin's secret hatred grows ever greater, for he desired above all things to possess her, the only heir of the king of Gondolin. You'll remember that all the way back in the beginning of Maeglin's story, back when he's living with his father and mother in the dark forest, that he is interested most in the stories of Gondolin because he knows that King Turgon has no heir, and no possibility of an heir, because Turgon's wife is lost in the Helcaraxe, in the crossing of the Helcaraxe, and thus there's no opportunity for Turgon to have more children because elves wed once, Finwë excluded. So they are married and everything is awesome, except Maeglin skulking around the city. But the most important thing about this story, honestly, if you believe the title that it's given in the original form that it takes, the most important thing about the story happens in the year 503 of the Years of the Sun. In the spring of the year after was born in Gondolin Eärendil half-elven, the son of Tuor and Idril Celebrimbor, and that was 500 years and 3 since the coming of the Noldor to Middle-earth. Of surpassing beauty was Eärendil, for a light was in his face as the light of heaven, and he had the beauty and the wisdom of the Eldar, and the strength and hardihood of the men of old, and the sea spoke ever in his ear and heart, even as with Tuor his father. Then the days of Gondolin were yet full of joy and peace, and none knew the region wherein the hidden kingdom lay had been at last revealed to Morgoth by the cries of Hurin, when standing in the wilderness beyond the encircling mountains, and finding no entrance, he called on Turgon in despair. Thereafter the thought of Morgoth was bent unceasing on the mountainous land between Anach and the upper waters of Sirion, whither his servants had never passed. Yet still no spy or creature out of Angband could come there because of the vigilance of the eagles, and Morgoth was thwarted in the fulfillment of his designs. But Idril Celebrimbor was wise and far-seeing, and her heart misgave her, and foreboding crept upon her spirit as a cloud. Therefore, in that time, she let prepare a secret way that could lead down from the city, and passing out beneath the surface of the plain, issue far beyond the walls, northward of Amon-Gwareth. And she contrived it that the work was known but to few, and no whisper of it came to Maeglin's ears. A huge commendation for the wisdom and farsightedness of Idril Celebrimbor here, not just for preparing this hidden escape route, but also for keeping it from the ears of Maeglin, demonstrating how wise, how smart, how aware Idril is of her surroundings here. But much more importantly, every time the text of the Quenta Silmarillion in particular, the Years of the Sun Quenta Silmarillion doubly so, every time we get a specific date, something bad is about to happen. So when we hear that it is 500 years and 3 since the coming of the Noldor to Middle-earth, you know that something bad is right there on the horizon, but not right now. Eärendil, sea lover in the Quenya, in the sense of devotion to the sea. And I don't know, honestly, how excited the average reader of the Silmarillion gets in this moment, the first time through the book. But I, as you may know, love Tolkien's poetry. And I, as you may know, love the Eärendil, the poem that Bilbo recites in Rivendell. It's maybe, God, it is maybe my favorite, honestly. And if it's not my favorite, I will absolutely, happily, readily, eagerly concede that it is the most astonishing and impressive piece of work in the entire book. There is a reason, I think, that those lines sing within us. Eärendil was a mariner who tarried in Avernian, and I will resist the urge to quote the whole thing, but it's such an astonishing piece of work, and Eärendil becomes such a powerfully mythic figure in a book which generally, I think, gives us that Tolkienian impression of depth, right? It gives us the illusion of depth and complexity. It gives us this deep, rich history, but we don't really apply too much pressure to it as we move through. As we said, there are barely any references to the Valar at all in The Lord of the Rings. Two that I can think of immediately. Maybe there are a couple more, but that's about it. We don't spend a lot of time on this deep, deep history, but Eärendil is a character that shines through, and partly it's the power of the poem, partly it's the iconography. Of course, he's given this very clear and intentional kind of visual iconography, which is not true of a lot of characters in The Lord of the Rings. His sword of steel was valiant of adamant, his helmet tall, an eagle plume upon his crest, upon his breast an emerald, right? That just really pops in the imaginary as you are reading that song. So I am thrilled when we get to Eärendil. I was thrilled the first time coming through the Silmarillion. More on Eärendil next week, I guess. We're going to have the opportunity to talk about basically the entirety of his story next week as we conclude the Quenta Silmarillion. This isn't, crucially, the only time that we see Idril being foresighted, right? It's not the only time we're going to see her feel this darkness upon her, but her decision here is doubly interesting, not just because, as I say, she is demonstrating wisdom, she is demonstrating acuity, she is demonstrating an awareness of her circumstances and a sensitivity to what we think of as kind of visions of the future, of prophetic visions in the pages of the Silmarillion. She's sensitive to all of those things too, but crucially, she is very quietly here defiant, because she isn't just breaking the edict laid down by her father that there shall be no way in or out of Tumladen, right? There will be no breaking of the leaguer around Gondolin. Not only is she defiant of that instruction, but she is the heir. She is the heir to the throne of Gondolin, so she's kind of abrogating her responsibility to her people in a really interesting way, right? This is a politically charged decision, and this is one of the elements of this story that I would just love to have and to explore more fully. I think that this moment, this year and a half, I guess, between the falling in love of Tuor and Idril and the birth of Eärendil and then the immediate aftermath of that, I'm fascinated by that period in history. Okay. We have what do we have? 4 more slides to the end of the chapter. Let's pick up the pace here. 20 minutes. Now, on a time when Eärendil was yet young, Maeglin was lost, for he, as has been told, loved mining and quarrying after metals above all other craft. And he was master and leader of the elves who worked in the mountains distant from the city, seeking after metals for their smithying of things both of peace and war. But often Maeglin went with few of his folk beyond the leaguer of the hills, and the king knew not that his bidding was defied. And thus it came to pass, as fate willed, that Maeglin was taken prisoner by orcs and brought to Angband. Maeglin was no weakling or craven, but the torment wherewith he was threatened cowed his spirit, and he purchased his life and freedom by revealing to Morgoth the very place of Gondolin and the ways whereby it might be found and assailed. Great indeed was the joy of Morgoth, and to Maeglin he promised the lordship of Gondolin as his vassal and the possession of Idril Celebrimbor when the city should be taken. And indeed desire for Idril and hatred for Tuor led Maeglin the easier to his treachery, most infamous in all the histories of the elder days. But Morgoth sent him back to Gondolin lest any should suspect the betrayal, and so that Maeglin should aid the assault from within when the hour came, and he abode in the halls of the king with smiling face and evil in his heart, while the darkness gathered ever deeper upon Idril. So here again we see the sensitivity of Idril to these moments of prophecy, to these turning points of fate. And if you hadn't read ahead and you weren't sure why I was so down on Maeglin through all of our many readings of him, being quiet in earlier chapters, this is why. The most infamous treachery in all the histories of the Elder Days. This is the greatest moment of betrayal in the Legendarium. I cannot think of a greater moment of treachery than Maeglin here. And the way that Tolkien chooses to emphasize this, I think, is so fascinating, right? Because we get the assurance first that he is no weakling or craven, but the torment wherewith he was threatened cowed his spirit, right? Maeglin, as we know, is not, he's no Grima Wormtongue, right? He's actually kind of a stand-up dude. He goes with Turgon to battle in the Nirnaeth Arnodiad, even when Turgon says that he should remain behind. He is physically, capable. He is an impressive sort. And we emphasize that here, opposing it with this threat of torment, with this threat of torture. And he purchases his life and freedom by revealing to Morgoth the very place of Gondolin. Okay, we don't feel good about that, but we can maybe forgive it. We can maybe justify it in that moment, right? It seems as though we're being offered an explanation, but then the narrative turns and instead doubles down on the fact that he's actually too eager to do this. And indeed desire for Idril and hatred for Tuor led Maeglin the easier to his treachery, most infamous in all the histories of the Elder Days, and then he returns with a smiling face and evil in his heart. We're doing this lovely little two-step here where, sure, he's a strong dude. He is no coward. He is no craven here. He is no weakling, but he is daunted by the torments of Morgoth. interesting that we don't get mention of Túrin here, of course, who is Húrin Thalion, who is Túrin the Steadfast, who withstands everything that Morgoth can throw at him. We don't have that opposition. Instead, we reassure the reader that Maeglin is strong, and then have him eagerly surrender himself and return to Gondolin to sow yet more evil. Let's move on to the next slide here. It is the year 510 of the Years of the Sun, and Gondolin falls. At last, in the year when Eärendil was 7 years old, Morgoth was ready, and he loosed upon Gondolin his Balrogs and his orcs and his wolves, and with them came dragons of the brood of Glaurung, and they were become now many and terrible. The host of Morgoth came over the northern hills, where the height was greatest and the watch least vigilant, and it came at night upon a time of festival, when all the people of Gondolin were upon the walls to await the rising sun, and sing their songs at its uplifting, for the morrow was the great feast that they named the Gates of Summer. But the red light mounted the hills in the north and not in the east, and there was no stay in the advance of the foe until they were beneath the very walls of Gondolin, and the city was beleaguered without hope. Of the deeds of desperate valour there done by the chieftains of the noble houses and their warriors, and not least by Tuor, much is told in the fall of Gondolin. Of the battle of Icthelion of the Fountain with Gothmog, lord of Balrogs, in the very square of the king, where each slew the other, and of the defence of the Tower of Turgon by the people of his household, until the tower was overthrown, and mighty was its fall, and the fall of Turgon in its ruin. Tuor sought to rescue Idril from the sack of the city, but Maeglin had laid hands on her and on Eärendil. And Tuor fought with Maeglin on the walls and cast him far out, and his body as it fell smote the rocky slopes of Amon Gwareth thrice ere it pitched into the flames below. Then Tuor and Idril led such remnants of the people of Gondolin as they could gather in the confusion of the burning down the secret way which Idril had prepared. And of that passage the captains of Angband knew nothing, and thought not that any fugitives would take a path toward the north and the highest parts of the mountains and the nighest to Angband. The fume of the burning and the steam of the fair fountains of Gondolin, withering in the flame of the dragons of the north, fell upon the vale of Tumladin in mournful mists. And thus was the escape of Tuor and his company aided, for there was still a long and open road to follow from the tunnel's mouth to the foothills of the mountains. Nonetheless they came thither, and beyond hope they climbed in woe and misery, for the high places were cold and terrible, and they had among them many that were wounded, and women and children. Morgoth attacks again at a time of festival because the old strategies are the best, I guess. Just like in Valinor, just like at the breaking of the lamps, when the Valar are hanging out at Almaran in the Great Lake. And it's tempting even, I think, to see this echo as a deliberate echo, as a reflection of those earlier moments. The darkening of the light of the lamps, the darkening of the light of the trees, and the darkening of the light of elven civilization in Beleriand. Icthelion slays Gothmog, who slew Feanor and captured Húrin Thalion. Icthelion really proving himself in the scoreboard of all of the heroes of Beleriand at this point. We get this moment of Turgon's people battling at the Tower of the King without much mention of where the king is or what the king is doing. We get Tuor killing Maeglin in a manner that is broadly consistent with the curse or the prophecy, I suppose, of Eöl at the moment of his death. This is the quote from Eöl. And Maeglin stood by and said nothing, but at the last Eöl cried out, "So you forsake your father and his kin, ill-gotten son. Here shall you fail of all your hopes, and here may you yet die the same death as I." Which he kind of does, right? We have him being thrown from the walls of Gondolin. So broadly, yes, there's interesting detail here that I may have to put a pin in to talk about at some point in the future. Let me raise it now, and we'll maybe circle back to it next week to consider the implications of this, because Maeglin hitting the wall 3 times, right? His body as it fell smote the rocky slopes of Amon Gwareth thrice ere it pitched into the flames below. The hitting of the wall 3 times is in the Tuor A version of the manuscript back in the Lost Tales. It's being preserved here by Christopher as a detail from that version of the story. But things happening thrice is, of course, an interesting recurring beat through the Silmarillion. I did like a quick examination of the text, and some things jumped out immediately. Thrice the forces of Feanor are beaten back by the Teleri at Alqualande before Fingon shows up to help him seal the deal of the first kinslaying, right? Fëanor curses Morgoth thrice right when he dies. You'll remember us looking at that right at the beginning of today's reading. Fingolfin is driven to his knees thrice by Morgoth during their duel, and he gets up thrice too. And finally, and I'm not sure that there's a real pattern developing here, the other one that stood out to me is, of course, the very good dog Huan speaking 3 times, right? He speaks thrice. But we also get the symbolism, the kind of the mythic power, the numerological significance of the number 3, well, up and down the Silmarillion. It's all over the place. The 3 houses of the elves, the 3 houses of the Edain, the 3 Silmarils, the 3 peaks of Thangorodrim. There's a lot attached here, and I'm wondering if there is a specific application of that kind of numerological instinct, that numerological symbolism right here as Maeglin hits the Amon Gwareth 3 times before falling into the sea of fire that now fills Tumladen. Let's move on just to make sure that we get through all of our slides for this week, and then maybe we can circle back to any outstanding points at the beginning of next week's session. There was a dreadful pass, Cirith Thorenath it was named, the Eagle's Cleft, where beneath the shadow of the highest peaks a narrow path wound its way. On the right hand it was walled by a precipice, and on the left a dreadful fall leapt into emptiness. Along that narrow way the march was strung, when they were ambushed by orcs, for Morgoth had set watchers all about the encircling hills, and a Balrog was with them. Then dreadful was their plight, and hardly would they have been saved by the valor of... hardly would they have been saved by the valor of yellow-haired Glorfindel, chief of the House of the Golden Flower of Gondolin, had not Thorondor come timely to their aid. Many are the songs that have been sung of the duel of Glorfindel with the Balrog upon the pinnacle of rock in that high place, and both fell to ruin in the abyss. But the eagles coming stooped upon the orcs and drove them shrieking back, and all were slain or cast into the deeps, so that rumour of the escape from Gondolin came not until long after to Morgoth's ears. Then Thorondor bore up Glorfindel's body out of the abyss, and they buried him in a mound of stones beside the pass. And a green turf came there, and yellow flowers bloomed upon it amid the barrenness of stone, until the world was changed. The brilliance here of Glorfindel, Glorfindavid. I wish you could be more present in the chat for this moment, if for no other. Typologically here, we're seeing echoes, of course, with, battling a Balrog and falling into an abyss. I could see an extra scene added to the text in Minas Tirith after the War of the Ring, when Glorfindel and Gandalf are comparing notes. Oh, you fell how far? Wow, no, I fell out of sight and out of mind. In fact, it was a very long fall following my battle with a Balrog. We see again here, too, the curious sanctity of burial sites, of these ritual sites. Glorfindel added to the list here of sites which take on an odd, robust, defiant healthiness in these moments. A green turf came there and yellow flowers bloomed upon it amid the barrenness of stone until the world was changed, right? We're already told that we're high up here in the mountains. It is cold. It is dangerous. It is unsuitable for people to be, but this one green sword shall arise here from Glorfindel's grave, which is just, I mention this every time we come across one of these because I find it so absolutely fascinating. All right, one more slide to get to. Let's see if we can wrap up this chapter. But Morgoth thought that his triumph was fulfilled, recking little of the sons of Fëanor and of their oath, which had harmed him never, and turned always to his mightiest aid. And in his black thought he laughed, regretting not that one Silmaril that he had lost, for by it he deemed the last shred of the people of the Eldar should vanish from Middle-earth, and trouble it no more. If he knew of the dwelling by the waters of Sirion, he gave no sign, biding his time, and waiting upon the working of oath and lie. Yet by Sirion and the sea there grew up an elven folk, the gleanings of Doriath and Gondolin, and from Valar the mariners of Círdan came among them, and they took to the waves and the building of ships, dwelling ever nigh to the coasts of Arvernian, under the shadow of Ulmo's hand. And it is said that in time Ulmo came to Valinor out of deep waters, and spoke there to the Valar of the need of the elves, and he called on them to forgive them, and rescue them from the overmastering might of Morgoth, and win back the Silmarils, wherein alone now bloomed the light of the days of bliss, when the 2 trees still shone in Valinor. But Manwë moved not. And of the counsels of his heart what tales should tell? The wise have said that the hour was not yet come, and that only one speaking in person for the cause of both elves and man, pleading for pardon on their misdeeds and pity on their woes, might move the counsels of the powers, and the oath of Fëanor perhaps even Manwë could not loose, until it found its end, and the sons of Fëanor relinquished the Silmarils, upon which they had laid their ruthless claim. For the light which lit the Silmarils the Valar themselves had made. In those days, Tuor felt old age creep upon him, and ever a longing for the deeps of the sea grew stronger in his heart. Therefore he built a great ship, and he named it Earame, which is Sea-wing. And with Idril Celebrimbor he set sail into the sunset and the west, and came no more into any tale or song. But in after days it was sung that Tuor alone of mortal man was numbered among the elder race, and was joined with the Noldor whom he loved, and his fate is sundered from the fate of man. Recking there in that first line, meaning considering or caring. It is the root, of course, of the word reckless, to do something without care. So recking is considering or caring about something. And brilliantly, Etym Online, the etymological dictionary that I use all the time and have used for, God, I don't even know, 15 years at this point as a constant resource. Etym Online cites and credits an example from the Return of the King, from the Siege of Gondor, when they have made it through the night and they hear the horns of the Rohirrim coming, the quote, and in that very moment, away behind in some courtyard of the city, a cock crowed, shrill and clear he crowed, recking nothing of wizardry or war, welcoming only the morning that in the sky far above the shadows of death was coming with the dawn. And then they hear the horns of the Rohirrim, and whew, it's a hell of a moment. It's a hell of a moment. You guys, I don't know if you've read it. Obviously, you're real Silmarillion scholars, but if you haven't looked at The Lord of the Rings, maybe you should check it out there. We are going to talk a lot more about what Ulmo says to Manwë in particular, but to the other Valar in Valinor in next week's reading, because it's going to be very specific, and it's very specifically foreshadowing, someone who can speak for both elves and men, some kind of half-elven. And obviously to get there, you'd have to go across the sea, so some kind of, mariner. And obviously to be a mariner, you would have to love the sea, some kind of sea lover, half-elven, the mariner. Maybe we'll meet him in next week's session. I do want to call out, though, the end of Tuor's story here. In those days, Tuor felt old age creep upon him. Tuor is 53 when he departs Middle-earth forever, which isn't even old by the standards of the men of that age, right? We've had people living into their... Hurin lived into, his 70s at that point, by the time his fate finally comes upon him. But Tuor feels the longing for the deeps of the sea, right? This is what is foreshadowed earlier when he first sees Balaigr, the great sea. So he builds the ship, he names it Earame, which is Sea-wing, a real candidate for most diacritical marks in a relatively short word, right? 2 umlauts and a little accent grave, accent acute. I can never remember which one is which, but 3 diacritical marks in 7 letters is still pretty healthy. And then he passes out of the story. I will say that in other versions of the text, Voronwe is also counted among his crew. It's Tuor and Idril and Voronwe all going together out to the west, to the sea, passing out of story and song. But in after days it was sung that Tuor alone of mortal men was numbered among the elder race, and was joined with the Noldor whom he loved, and his fate is sundered from the fate of man, which is, on the one hand, so poetic and beautiful and lovely and such an interesting counterpoint to the story of Beren and Luthien, right? It is almost consciously a counterpoint to the story of Beren and Luthien, with Túrin kind of falling into this awful cleft between the two stories. This this cleft of despair. But you've got Beren on one side of Beren and Luthien, I suppose, on one side of the scale, and you've got Tuor and Idril on the other side of that same scale, and then in the middle, just compromised and crossed by fate, you have, I guess, Túrin and Finduilas and Nienor all caught up in that same space, perhaps. We'll talk a little more about that too in next week's reading, because I'm afraid that's basically it. I am basically at time. It has been an absolute pleasure talking about Tuor, and if this has felt brief, if it has felt somewhat incomplete, as I say, I think that is a consequence of the narrative mode in which we find ourselves at this point in the book. In next week's reading, we're going to look at Eärendil. That is going to, let me in fact just pop up the little slide here with the schedule on it. Next week, we're going to try and cover all of the story of Eärendil, all of Chapter 24 of the Quenta Silmarillion. That is right now looking like it's going to be Thursday, and then certainly the following week, that will also be Thursday. So Thursday evenings, hopefully for the next couple of weeks, to look first at the story of Eärendil, and then to look at the Akalabaeth and Numenor and the Second Age. That's going to be a long reading, but we are... I don't know. We might end up just looking very deeply at that. in theory, we've got 3 more weeks of the Silmarillion. In practice, we might have 6 more weeks of the Silmarillion. There is at this point no way to be sure, but you know how these things spiral wildly out of control, even when I am effectively alone doing this broadcast. And almost no one, besides Glorf and David popping in to say hi, almost no one has joined me in the chat today, because presumably it is a Sunday afternoon and y'all have better things to do, because it's the height of summer and Sunday afternoons are not for this. But Thursday evenings are for this. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support the work that I do, if you would like to help me, invest in some more coffee so that I can speak more quickly and cover more slides in every single session of Stars and Swords, you can head on over to the Patreon page, patreon.com/nextword. That is where you can sign up for free to just follow the page and get the updates on each live session. I know the schedule is somewhat unpredictable. That has been an ongoing problem over the last, couple of months, I suppose. I am looking very seriously at fixing the schedule and actually making these things more reliable. So hopefully you'll be able to rely on our Thursday evenings discussions for Stars and Swords going forward, and some new discussions, some new live episodes for the new Tolkien show, which begins in just a couple of weeks. More on that in the very near future. But you can follow patreon.com/nextword for free to get the links to these live sessions, to come and hang out in the chat, or you can pledge a few dollars of support over there to help me update some of these systems. And as I say, buy more coffee. The name of Gandalf's sword is, of course, Glamdring. That came to me halfway through reading one of those latter slides. I can't believe that faltered in my brain. Glaurung eclipsed Glamdring for just a moment. But it was a crucial moment. And in that moment, I let myself down, and I really let you all down. So I'm going to go and have a long, hard think about what I've done, and no post-show whiskey for me today. Not least of all because it's only 2:30 in the afternoon, 3:30 in the afternoon. Forgive me. Wow. It's off the rails. That is going to do it for this week's show. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you will be able to join me next week for our discussion of the story of Eärendil and closing out the Quenta Silmarillion. It's a huge turning point in our discussion of this book. I hope you'll be able to join me for that. Until then,